Okay, perfect. So we are live.
Cool.
So if anyone wants to join the conversation or have like something to ask Mark right now or Marcel or myself, feel free to do so. So testing, yes, I see your message on testing. I'm gonna test the banner as well.
Do we have a attendees list anywhere in here?
Right now, there's 0 people so far.
Okay.
But also, let me make sure that that is actually live on YouTube. So, second. Okay. Yeah, it is live. Perfect. Cool. So another thing that I wanted to ask you. So there's some example questions right here, right? Can you see them?
No. Where am I supposed to be looking? Okay.
Can you see those?
How do you use Redux properly in React? Okay.
So I actually, this is kind of weird because, actually, never mind. I'm gonna raise these questions because I noticed that whoever like put them back, they were for Brian, like back in the middle, back in the days that you were in that one. So I'm just gonna, yeah. So just let me remove them, just make sure that I don't get confused. And so there's already like 10 people.
Cool.
So I'm just gonna give it like 5 more minutes just to make sure like we get a bigger audience. And so yeah.
Yeah, let's put it this way. I'm not going to have a problem being short of an hour.
Okay. How long is your talk?
However long I keep talking.
That's actually funny because like I know like you're like super passionate about this topic, and so I'm like, Mark, talk as much as you want. So that's all you. And as long as people have questions or something, you can keep talking about it. So I'm like super excited about this because like you are actually one of the people, like I don't know if you remember, like a few months ago, like 6 months ago, you were one of the people who like make me feel welcome into the React community. I posted something about like Redux, and you replied with an article on why Redux is not dead, something like that. So now my job is now to keep sharing that article so it reaches more people. I think it's like an amazing article. It was like an eye opening, and so I loved it. So yeah.
I mean, like really, my problem when giving talks is trying to avoid going too deep into the weeds and spending too much time on any one given slide, especially because like my whole family has a history of describing things in great detail from the very beginning. And a lot of times I feel like I need to go back and give background info just in case people don't know it. And sometimes that's helpful, and sometimes you just kind of need to keep going with whatever the actual topic is supposed to be.
Yeah. That makes sense. That actually makes 100% sense. So how did you get into being a Redux maintainer?
Entirely by accident. And
I guess a good accident, right?
And in fact, I actually talked about this in another podcast, the JS Party podcast about a week and a half ago. I started learning React and Redux. Well, I started learning React in the summer of 2015, and Redux was literally being developed at that time. And I was just doing my usual thing of reading blog posts and tutorials on whatever it was I was trying to learn. And at the time, there was another Flux library called Alt, which kind of had some mindshare. And I started seeing this Redux thing being mentioned, started looking at it some. And over the next few months, as I was hanging out in Reactiflux, which was originally on Slack and then moved over to Discord, I was just lurking and trying to learn from all the other conversations going on. Eventually, I started seeing questions that I knew the answer to, and I would help answer them or point to a useful link. And it kind of kept growing, so that by January of 16, I kind of half volunteered to write an FAQ page for the Redux docs. And I did that, and Dan gave me commit rights. But for the next several months, I really didn't feel like I had any real privilege to touch the code at all. So I was just kind of helping answer questions in the issues, close issues that were clearly unrelated, that sort of thing. Dan got hired to work at Facebook on React. And by that summer of 16, he told myself and another guy named Tim Dorr that, well, you two are the maintainers now. Have fun. Here are the keys. And even after that, it still took a few months until I really felt like I was a maintainer and actually had the right to really kind of say, this is how it should be used or what we should do with the code.
Super cool, super interesting. That's actually really awesome. Really awesome. Have you tried like more Redux libraries? I mean, more like state management libraries?
Not really, and it's not that I necessarily don't want to, but I just don't have time to. Like, there's a lot of other cool libraries in the ecosystem, but there's so much going on with Redux, as we'll see here in a few minutes, that I don't have time to do all the things I want to do around Redux itself, much less devote much time to trying out a bunch of other things.
Makes sense. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Mark, are you ready?
Sure, let's do this.
Well, I'm gonna present now my screen. So is everything good? Can you see the presentation?
I see the Global React Meetup slide if that's what you're looking at.
Yes, perfect. Awesome. So welcome everyone to the Global React Meetup presented by This.media. So I'm super excited to have you guys here like every month. This meetup is sponsored by This.labs. We are your partners in digital transformation. If you are looking for enterprise training in cool technologies like Angular, React, Vue, and so on, make sure to send us an email or reach out to us via Twitter at This.labs. A few announcements. On October 28th, we have our monthly mentoring session for women in technology. It's going to take time at 10 a.m. Eastern time. It's free. Make sure to join. And the next Global React Meetup is going to take place in November the 12th. If you ever feel like wanting to give in the talk, feel free to reach out to me. My Twitter handle is devpato, DEVPATO, and then you can like send me your presentation and we go over it and then just get approved and get you scheduled for you to give a talk. And the next event that we have is the GraphQL Contribution Days. It's going to take place in November the 17th at 8 a.m. and PDT and 11 a.m. Standard Day time. So don't forget to also jump into your JavaScript Marathon. It's once again another free event sponsored by This.media, and we are going to have a awesome presenter. His name is Carl Hill. He's one of my coworkers, and he's going to be talking about React Hooks 201 because the previous stuff was 101. So if you missed it, feel free to watch it on YouTube in the This.labs channel. And then so to make sure that you're ahead and don't get behind with the 201 version. So now today I'm like super excited because we have Mark Erikson. He is a awesome software engineer. He works for Northrop Grumman, and he is a Redux maintainer. I'm pretty sure all of you guys know him. He's a local celeb, and he's like super helpful. He made me feel welcome into the React community. So I really appreciate it. That was awesome. And so Mark, I'm gonna hand the stage to you, and let's get started.
Cool. All right, good afternoon, folks. My name is Mark Erikson, and I am very excited to be talking to you today about the state of Redux. A couple things about myself first. I am an answerer of questions. You can generally find me under the handles @AceMarkE or @MarkErikson, and I will answer questions about React and Redux basically anywhere there is a comment box on the internet. I am a collector of interesting links. I have a couple large repos where I've collected useful links related to React and Redux, and most of my answers also usually involve pasting some links from somewhere. I am a writer of very long blog posts, such as my articles on idiomatic Redux usage patterns and the recent article, A Mostly Complete Guide to React Rendering Behavior. And I am a Redux maintainer. I've written several very large sections of the Redux docs, worked a lot on the recent versions of React Redux, and created a library called Redux Toolkit, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But if you're not familiar with me for any of those reasons, then you might know me as that guy with the Simpsons avatar. It's sort of become my calling card. I'm really not even a Simpsons fan in the first place, but it's a thing. It works. All right, so let's start with the question, which is unfortunately on everyone's minds at this point. Is Redux dead? I'm sorry to say I get this question all the time, but the answer to this, of course, is no. It is most definitely not dead. And let's talk about some reasons behind that. So first off, my rough statistics that I've seen say that about 50% of all React apps use Redux. And it's being used in a lot of very large major projects right now. Like if you're using Twitter, that's got Redux inside of it. Spotify, Slack, WordPress, the Firefox DevTools. Redux is being used in a lot of different places. And in case you're wondering, Redux is not a Facebook project. It's a totally independent open source project maintained by myself and Tim Dorr. So Redux is being used by a lot of people, and I can guarantee you it's going to be around for a very long time. One bit of evidence for that is the download statistics. So I pulled these off of the NPM Stats website just a couple of days ago. And if you look at the download statistics for both the Redux core library and React Redux for the month of September, you can see that when we compare the downloads for Redux with other similar libraries, Redux is still getting anywhere from 5 to 10 times as many downloads as the other packages. And similarly for React Redux, it's tracking just a little below 50% of the total downloads for React itself at this point. And to be clear, I'm not trying to say that any of these other libraries are bad or that you shouldn't use them, just that when people say Redux is dead, that kind of implies that no one is downloading it and using it. And the download stats clearly indicate that there's a lot of people downloading it. So just some evidence that says it's doing quite well at this point. So let's talk about a couple myths or questions or concerns that commonly come up. And one of the things you hear a lot is that Redux is overused. This one is absolutely true. And there's a lot of reasons why Redux has been used a lot more than it really probably should have been in a lot of cases. The point I always try to emphasize is that no matter what set of tools you're dealing with, you should try to figure out what kind of problems do I actually have? What kind of tools could help solve those problems? And then look at the tools that are available, how they help you solve those problems, and pick the tools that actually match the problems you have. We do have some guidance in the Redux docs that tries to help suggest, like, when should I even use Redux? Or like, how do I mix and match when to put something in Redux versus when to keep something inside of a React component? And it's not necessarily hard guidelines, but there are some very good rules of thumb that we have in there. One other thing to keep in mind here, though, there's a lot of chatter on social media, and this is especially where you kind of see a lot of this like Redux is dead discussion popping up seemingly every few weeks. Just because someone says a thing on Twitter does not necessarily mean it's true. It's worth reading opinions and discussions on Twitter, but don't assume that just because a new library exists or someone says a thing is dead, that's necessarily the case. If a tool solves your problem, then you should look at using it. Another common thing that comes up is GraphQL can replace Redux. And GraphQL is a great thing. No, but one thing to keep in mind is that GraphQL by itself is just a protocol that says, here's how we're going to format a request for some data, and here's how we're going to format the response. Now, when people say, I'm going to use GraphQL, typically the assumption is that you're going to use a specific client with that, like Apollo or Urkel or something like that. And Apollo in particular provides a lot of caching and normalization capabilities. Now, if the only thing you were doing with Redux was using it to cache state fetched from the server and potentially keep it in a normalized form, and you choose to use GraphQL and Apollo, well, they fill that use case, and you don't necessarily need Redux anymore in that situation. I know that Apollo version 3 does have some capabilities built in for trying to keep track of some local state on the client as well. Now, I'm biased, but looking at the examples that they have in there, I don't feel like the syntax is really necessarily an improvement. I understand why they added it in there, and it is a thing you can use. I wouldn't necessarily lean towards it as my first choice. There are also some very similar tools like React Query and SWR, whose focus is also on data fetching and caching, but typically more for like a REST API. And it's really the same situation there. If the only thing you're doing with Redux is caching data from a server, and you choose to use one of these tools, well, you've filled that use case, and you probably don't need Redux in that situation. The other one that comes up all the time is that Redux can be replaced by React Context. And typically people just say context when they're making this comparison. And I think this is really sparked by a misunderstanding of what context actually is. Context by itself is not a state management tool. Context is a dependency injection system, and the only job of context is to take some value that you provide and to make that value accessible to a specific subtree of your React components. And it's entirely up to you to decide what that value is and take care of any updates to that value. So typically what you do is you keep track of a value in React component state via, say, the use state or the use reducer hooks. And it's up to you to handle passing down the value and maybe like passing down the dispatch function or a callback that sets state so that it does the updating. So context is a distribution mechanism, but it is not a state management system in and of itself. Now, yes, if you combine, say, use context and use reducer, those do look a lot like Redux, and that is more of a state management system when you put them together. But there are actually some limitations there. You can't use dev tools or the middleware with use reducer. And right now, React Context has some limitations in when and how components will re-render based on changes to the context value. And again, these are not totally mutually exclusive things. You can use local component state, even use reducer and context in an app at the same time that you use React and Redux together. Now, there are some questions down the road about how Redux is going to behave in conjunction with React's suspense and concurrent mode features. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a couple minutes, but long term, we're going to see how that plays out once suspense is actually ready. One thing I have noticed is that the ecosystem is really trying to solve a different set of problems now than they were back in 2015. If you look at Facebook's original announcement of the Flux architecture in 2014, the problem they were trying to solve was event-driven state libraries like Backbone causing a cascading series of events bouncing all over the app so that you don't know why something changed in the first place. And so Flux and Redux were invented to solve that problem. These days, though, the ecosystem seems a lot more focused on data caching and fetching than anything else. People aren't so concerned about wanting to manage their state. they just want to say, fetch this data from the server, give me an is loading flag and the value, let me know when it's done. Okay, thanks, bye. And so that's really what you see with Apollo and React Query and stuff. So people are kind of trying to solve a different set of problems today, I think. And we're definitely not going to try to turn Redux into a big clone of Apollo, but I do think there's some things we can do to try to add additional APIs or help solve some of those use cases a little bit better if you're using Redux. So in general, I would highly suggest that people take a look at my post, Redux Not Dead Yet. And Dave said he also has a very good article on Redux versus the React Context API. So overall, Apollo and Suspense and React Query and all these other tools are great tools that are very useful for those specific use cases. And you should look at those tools to see if they solve your problems. But at the same time, Redux is still a very valid choice and has some use cases and advantages when compared to other tools. So it all depends on what problems you are specifically trying to solve. The other thing to keep in mind is that Redux is kind of a jack of all trades. A quote that I saw early on is that it's a platform for developers to build customized state management for their use cases while being able to reuse things like the graphical debugger or the middleware. So you can use Redux for a lot of different things. UI state, server caching, state machines, other stuff. And it probably isn't going to be the absolute best tool for any one of those things because other people have built tools that are more specialized for those cases. But you can use it for any of those cases, and you can use it for all of those at once. So saying it one more time, look at what problems you have, pick the tools that help you solve those problems. So with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about React Redux. I wrote a blog post a couple years ago called The History and Implementation of React Redux, which talks about how Redux even works with the UI in the first place, how our API implementations have changed over time, and some of the details of the differences of the different versions that we've put out. And if you'd like to know more about how it actually works or why we've put out different versions, that's a good read that'll explain a lot of that information. So React Redux version 7 was something we built in the first few months of 2019. And we worked on it because version 6 didn't quite work out the way we hoped it would in some aspects of performance. So we rebuilt React Redux on top of the new React Hooks API, still based on the connect function. And we put that out in early 2019. And the other thing that version 7 did was it gave us the ability to design and ship the React Redux Hooks API. And we had some very long discussions about what that API should look like and what the trade-offs were in building it. And we finally settled on an implementation with really just two hooks, use selector and use dispatch. Use selector gives you the Redux state object and lets you grab out some piece of that state. And use dispatch just gives you the dispatch function from the store so you can use it in your components. And the Hooks API really gives a different set of trade-offs than the Connect API did, which reminds me that I really should have added at least 2 more articles linked in this slide. If you go to my blog, I have a pair of articles that talk about the differing trade-offs between hooks and higher order components. And there's specifically a blog post and a talk that I did at React Boston last fall on that topic. And so at this point, we are actually recommending that people use the Hooks API as the default way to use React Redux in their apps. Connect still works just fine. We're not removing it, but we also have no plans to make any real further changes to that API either. So what's the long-term plans for React Redux? So we're at 7.2 right now and really have no immediate plans to make any real changes in the version 7 line beyond maybe just a little bug fix or tweak that comes up. The long-term question is, how are we going to integrate with React's concurrent mode and suspense? And the biggest issue here is that in concurrent mode, React wants to be able to own all of the state updates so that it can pause work on something, and then maybe something higher priority like a user keyboard entry comes in, it can set aside the partially completed work, do the high priority update, and then go back and finish the low priority update on top of that. And if there's an external state tool involved, it really can't reorder things. So the React team has created a new hook called Use Mutable Source. And it was literally designed so that external state tools like Redux can cooperate better with concurrent mode. Might not be able to take 100% advantage of some of the concurrent mode features, but at least it'll be compatible enough to work well. As far as I know, that hook has not been officially released yet. And my guess is that it won't be until they consider suspense ready to go. So whenever suspense and concurrent mode are finally ready, I'm assuming that we'll probably build a React Redux version 8 based around that use mutable source hook, and we'll see how that works out. It is possible that the Connect API might not be fully compatible with concurrent mode. Maybe we'll be able to use mutable source inside. I don't know. I'm not worried about it. We'll worry about that sometime down the road. I've got far too many other things to worry about right now. So, moving on, let's talk about Redux Toolkit. So, over the years, there's been a lot of complaints about Redux, and they usually fall into a few different categories. Things like it's too hard to configure and set up a Redux store. You have to add a bunch of extra packages to do anything useful to it, like, say, the Thunk middleware. It's too easy to make mistakes like mutating state, and you have to write a lot of boilerplate code, like action types and action creators and nested object spread operators, and having to write your code in multiple different files for one feature and all this kind of stuff. And these are all very valid points of concern. There's good reasons why those patterns existed in the first place, but it's also true that you had to do a lot of extra work. So about a year and a half ago, we created a new package called Redux Toolkit. And it's kind of inspired by Create React App in that it's intended to be something that pulls together a bunch of other pieces into one tool that has our best practices baked in, and you get everything you need out of the box. So the goals for Redux Toolkit are things like simplifying the most common Redux use cases, providing some actual opinionated defaults, minimizing the amount of code you have to write by hand. You can opt into it. You can use it in day one on a new project or add it to an existing project. And it should provide a great experience if you're using TypeScript as well. We originally called this package Redux Starter Kit, but we renamed it after the 1.0 release because people were kind of confused. Like, is this a boilerplate repo that I'm supposed to clone? Is this only good for beginners or people who are starting with Redux? No, Redux Toolkit is good for everyone who is using Redux, and that's why we renamed it. And I specifically want to give a shout out to Lenz Weber, who is at Frenius on GitHub. He started contributing to Redux Toolkit probably about a year ago, and he's actually done the majority of the development work on the actual code in the last year. He's especially done a lot around our TypeScript typings, but he's also developed a number of new features, honestly, partly because some of the TypeScript types are too complicated for me to work on at this point. But he's done an amazing job on working on the code. He's done a huge amount of work providing help and support in the Reactiflux channels, and he's done a great job helping maintain this library. So let's do a quick run through of the APIs that Redux Toolkit provides. And the first one is Configure Store. if you're using the original Redux create store function, you wind up having to do a lot of different steps. You have to call apply middleware, you have to compose things together, you have to call combine reducers. And so configure store just kind of merges all those steps into one function call. At its shortest, you just provide the different reducers you want to use for your slices, and it automatically calls combine reducers, automatically adds some middleware, automatically sets up the Redux DevTools extension, one function call, and you're done. Now, you can still pass in some options. You can still add whatever extra middleware you want to use. You can control when the DevTools extension gets enabled, but the options are now passed as a named options object rather than being a bunch of positional fields. Now, one of the biggest pain points with using Redux over the years has been trying to do immutable updates, because JavaScript is mutable syntax by default. And so writing nested object spread operators has always been long and hard to read and painful and really easy to make mistakes. And Michelle Westrate, the author of the MobX library, created a really powerful library called Immer. And the idea is you call this function called produce, you pass in your original data as the first argument, and you pass in a callback that receives something that looks like your original data, but you can mutate this value. And all that mutating logic inside this callback is tracked by Immer, and it turns it into safe, correct, immutable updates as if you had done all those nested spread operators by hand. And so it makes that update code a lot shorter and a lot easier to work with. So Redux Toolkit was specifically built around using Immer internally. So we have a create reducer API that accepts a lookup table of action types to reducers instead of switch statement. And it uses Immer inside so that you can write that mutating syntax inside. We also have a create action function that will take a type string and generate action creators for you. But the real piece that you're going to use in your applications is create slice. Create slice accepts a name string and an initial state value and a set of reducer functions. And it's going to generate the set of action creators and action types based on the names of the reducer functions that you provided. So in this example, we've said that our slice has a name field of user, and one of the reducer functions is update user. So it automatically generates an action creator called update user, and the type string for that action object is going to be quote user slash update user. So there's no more writing, const add to do equals add to do everywhere. You just write the names of your functions, and you get the you get the action creators for free. And so this also makes it really easy to write the ducks or the slice file pattern, where you have all your Redux logic for a feature in one file, and then you just export the reducer and the action creators. This has always been something you could have done anyway, but create slice from Redux Toolkit just makes it really, really easy to do that. With create slice, you also have the ability to handle action types that were declared in other parts of the application using the extra reducers option. And as of right now, if you're going to write thunks or other similar logic, you would write those separately outside of the call to create slice, but probably in the same file. We actually have done some experimenting with trying to find a way to define thunks directly inside of create slice. Unfortunately, at the moment, it doesn't look like that's really feasible due to TypeScript limitations. You end up with a circular type dependency problem, and we don't currently know how we're going to solve that one. So we haven't shipped that feature yet, but it's still a thing we would like to do at some point if possible. Redux Toolkit also includes the create selector function from reselect, which we generally recommend using in your applications anyway. And then we have two relatively newer APIs that came out back in the spring. If you've ever written a Redux thunk function that fetches some data, you've probably seen the pattern where you dispatch one action before you make the API call, maybe to show some loading state. And then you dispatch another action if it succeeds, or a third action if it fails. And so create async thunk automates that pattern. You give it the prefix of an action type, and you provide a function that makes some API call and returns a promise. And it will automatically dispatch those action types based on the promise results. And then you can handle those actions in create slice based on the auto-generated action types from the thunk. So again, it's a thing you're probably doing in your Redux apps already. We're just providing an API that makes that easier. And then the last one to talk about is create entity adapter. So in our docs, we recommend normalizing your state. So if I have, say, state.posts for a blogging application, rather than storing all of the blog posts in an array, we recommend storing them in an object where the keys are the IDs of the items and the values are the blog post objects themselves. And that way it's really easy to look up any given item based on its ID. But we'd never provided any APIs to help with that process. So earlier this spring, I was looking over at the NGRX library, which is Redux ported to work with Angular, and they had created this thing called an entity adapter. And I looked at it, and it looked really cool, and so I ported that back to work with Redux Toolkit. And so create entity adapter generates a set of pre-built reducer functions for common CRUD type logic that you would want to apply within the rest of your reducers. So it has functions like add one, or add many, or set all, or upsert one. Like, I could write code that figures out what items already exist in the state, merges in the results, or I could just call adapter.upsert1, and it does that for me. So it's not a complete normalized caching system, but it gives you a lot of the logic for helping maintain that state that you would have had to write by yourself anyway. A couple other things about the Redux Toolkit. By far the most common mistake people have made with Redux is accidentally mutating their state. And so Redux Toolkit specifically includes a version of the Redux immutable state invariant middleware by default, and the configure store API automatically sets that up. Now, the good news is that if you're using create slice and create reducer, it's also basically impossible to mutate in the reducers because Immer will handle that. But sometimes people can actually mutate outside the reducers too. And so Redux Toolkit will catch those errors and warn you about it when that happens. So this basically eliminates the most common mistake that people make when using Redux. So what's the roadmap? Right now, we're on version 1.4. I'm not actively writing new features for it right now, but we do have a list of several things we would like to try to add at some point in the not too distant future. For example, with thunks, you can't listen and respond to dispatched actions the way you would with, say, Redux Saga or Redux Observable. So we'd like to add kind of a lighter weight middleware that says, when this action is dispatched, run this extra code. I'd really like to find a way to write thunks inside of create slice. I'd also like to find maybe a higher level data fetching abstraction. And there's a lot of discussion about what this might look like. And if people have use cases or suggestions, I would really appreciate having people comment in this issue so that we can help figure out what a good API for this might look like. I'd also like to make some updates to our documentation. I wrote a set of tutorials last fall, and they're not bad, but people have pointed out some things we could change. For example, the advanced tutorial is written using TypeScript. That probably ought to be a separate tutorial page. And the tutorials right now have a bit of a focus on migrating from plain Redux to Redux Toolkit. That also probably ought to be a usage guide page instead. So I'd like to redo these tutorials, but I don't have time to work on this myself right now. And I would really appreciate having some people jump in to help out with that. One other side item, most people are familiar with the Redux DevTools extension, but what you might not know is that the DevTools extension now has a feature that's called action stack traces. If you've ever tried to figure out, like, okay, I know this action was dispatched, but I don't know where it was in the code. So maybe you've had to do like a Control-Shift-F and search the whole code base for uses of that action type string, except that actually it's coming from an action creator, so that the code that dispatched the action didn't reference the action type, and I don't know where it is. You can actually turn on this action stack traces feature and see the exact line of code that actually dispatched that action in the first place. So if we see this example, there's a trace tab in the DevTools, and if you click on an action, you can actually see where that line of code is that dispatched the action in the first place. It does require that you turn that on when you set up the DevTools in the first place. And so Redux Toolkit's configure store function actually does enable that by default, since it's so useful. It's also worth noting that we now have a couple of Redux templates for Create React App, one for plain JavaScript and one for TypeScript. And they both come with Redux Toolkit and the React Redux Hooks API set up as the default. So you run Create React App, you say, I want to use the Redux or the Redux TypeScript template, and you get all those set up out of the box, ready to go. And so that is actually how we would recommend starting a new project with Redux at this point. All right, let's talk about documentation. I get irrationally excited about this topic, but it's also because I'm very passionate about trying to make sure that the Redux docs are good. So 3 years ago, I wrote a blog post saying we should look at the Redux docs and see if we can improve them. And actually, you know what? In fact, you can tell I wrote these slides a while back and then updated them. They were originally written 5 years ago, and they targeted a very different audience. At the time, Dan Abramov said, I'm trying to write these for people who are starting with Flux, people who are used to functional programming, and the docs really reflect the state of the ecosystem at that time. In fact, until recently, the basic tutorial started with, if you've ever written a Flux app, you'll feel right at home. Okay, how many people reading that page even know what Flux is, much less have actually written a Flux app in 2020? Nobody. So there's a lot of things that we really needed to update about the documentation. So I later created another issue to discuss what and how we ought to try to update, and I came up with a list of things that I wanted to try to improve. Reorganizing the content into a better structure, rewriting the tutorials, providing some more real-world usage documentation. And so I basically have been working on this docs rewrite task by myself intermittently for the last couple years. And the good news is I'm making some progress on this. So the biggest thing that's happened recently is I wrote a brand new tutorial called the Redux Essentials tutorial, which is a full 25,000 words long. I was originally going to call this the Redux Quick Start tutorial, and then I realized that you can't call something that's 25,000 words long a quick start, so I decided I ought to rename that. So this tutorial takes a very different approach than what we previously had in our documentation. The first thing is that it teaches Redux Toolkit and the React Redux Hooks API as the default way to write Redux code. And it also teaches a top-down and how to use this approach rather than a bottom-up how it works approach. Along with that, it actually builds out a real-world-ish kind of an application to demonstrate all these different principles. And when I wrote this, I took a lot of inspiration from other documentation sites and tutorials. I actually spent like a month just taking notes on other tutorials, trying to ask, what do they do well? What do they do badly? What techniques can I learn for how I can make our docs better? And so the new tutorials have things like a what you'll learn box at the top of the page, a recap of what you did learn at the end, call out boxes highlighting important information, expandable detailed explanations so that there's more info there if you want to learn more, but it's not distracting from the main explanations in the page. We've got diagrams, we've got embedded code sandboxes with the actual runnable code. And this is now the default tutorial on our site. So if you go there, it's Redux Essentials, and I've got a link in these slides. I will put these slides up on my blog sometime later this evening, by the way. So I put this out in July, and I'm really, really excited about this. And I've gotten a lot of really positive feedback that it's really helpful in trying to learn Redux. But we also have an existing tutorial sequence, the basics and advanced tutorial sections. And these have been good. A lot of people have learned Redux looking at these, but there's also a lot of problems with this as well. Again, we have a lot of outdated references to technologies and concepts that nobody really remembers anymore. The code examples don't really do a good job of showing the example apps that you're supposed to be building. And they teach a lot of practices that are now the opposite of what we recommend. So, the basics tutorial shows putting all your reducer logic in a reducers folder, or separating your React components into containers and presentational components, or writing all your action types as const add to do equals quote uppercase add to do. So right now I am working on writing a new Redux fundamentals tutorial sequence that is going to completely replace the existing basics sequence. So how is this different than the essentials tutorial? The essentials tutorial focuses on the high level, here's how to use this aspect. It doesn't explain how this works at a low level. And I think there is still a need for that lower level mechanics explanation. And it is worth understanding how to write this Redux code by hand, both so you understand what's going on and so that you better understand what Redux Toolkit is actually doing for you. So it's covering all the same concepts as the existing basic and advanced tutorial, like what is an action? What is a reducer? How do you create a store? How do you use this with React? How do you do async calls? But most of the content is either completely rewritten or heavily rephrased. It also takes a very different approach to some of the techniques that it shows inside. So we're now showing putting all your Redux logic in a single file for each feature by default. We're teaching the hooks API by default. We're writing our action types as constant as strings that are hard-coded directly inline, shaped like to-dos / to-do added, instead of having them separate const variables in their own file, just because it's fewer things for you to have to worry about. I'm also adding more information on what Redux is, why you might want to use it, why standard usage patterns exist, like why do we use action creators or selectors or normalized data. And the last section is going to be, let's take all this Redux code that we've written by hand for this example, and then migrate it to Redux Toolkit so that you can see how the conversion works and why Redux Toolkit does what it does. So right now, I've got a draft of this that is about 50% done. I basically whipped that out in like less than a week. I was really excited, really productive. Actually kind of had to pause work on that to prepare for this talk. But I think based on what I've gotten done so far and what's left to do, that I might have this done by the end of October. So there is a draft view of this that is available if you go look at the PR. And I would certainly appreciate any feedback on that. Please feel free to leave comments in the PR. Anything about things you want me to explain, anything that you think isn't explained well enough, typos, anything like that. Please let me know so that I can make that better. One other thing to note about the docs last year, I put together a page called the Redux Style Guide. So the Redux docs have always been very unopinionated. And that was really a very deliberate choice. People have used Redux in lots of ways. Like some people use thunks for async. Other people use sagas or observables or even like an API middleware. Some people liked using the file by type structure. Some people did file by feature, like lots of different approaches. And so a lot of the documentation just says, well, here's 5 different ways to do a thing. Have fun. But they didn't really give any guidance on when you might want to use an approach, or if one of those approaches is really better than a different one. And so we've gotten a lot of feedback that people really did want to know what the best ways are to use Redux. And we, or even I specifically, have formed a lot of opinions over the years as I've seen how people have tried to use Redux, what kind of problems they've run into. So last year, I wrote this style guide page, which lists our recommended best patterns and practices. And so it's things like, definitely don't mutate state, no side effects and reducers, one store. It's a really good idea to use Redux Toolkit, put your logic in one file per feature, put as much of the logic as possible in reducers, use TypeScript, use plain JavaScript objects, use React Redux hooks. And it's probably a good idea to write your action types as domain/event name, follow the Flux standard action structure, use thunks for async. But the idea is to provide some kind of guidance for people for what we think are good patterns to follow so that they have some idea what to do. You're always welcome to do something else if you want, but we think these patterns work pretty well. So besides all the work on the Redux core docs, the other couple libraries could use some help as well. The React Redux docs are still using Docusaurus version 1 to build the website, and I would like to update that to version 2 to match the other couple sites. The problem is that React Redux does maintain versioned docs to handle the API differences between version 5, 6, and 7. And I think Docusaurus v2 does support that, but someone needs to take the time to handle doing that upgrade. The docs could also use some more content, like the React Redux tutorial still teaches Connect. And while we have an API reference page for the hooks, we really need a usage guide page that explains some good practices for using them. Meanwhile, in the Redux Toolkit docs, the tutorials really need to be restructured to try to focus them on teaching how to use RTK. The problem there is that the tutorials currently assume you know what Redux is and how to use it by hand, and then they just jump into talking about the toolkit. And I don't know what the right balance is there between like how much should we assume you already know about Redux and how much should we try to teach about Redux in the Redux Toolkit tutorial. So something to be worked out there. Again, I don't have time to tackle this part myself, but I would love to get some folks from the community involved in reworking those docs. So overall, there is a lot of stuff that I have listed as things to do for reworking the Redux core docs. We want to add more content. We want to move existing content. We want to clean up content. And again, right now, I'm basically the only person doing that because I'm the only one who seems to care about it. And I would love to have people helping me out with this process, because the faster people help out, the sooner it gets done. Like I said, I would love to have some feedback on the fundamentals tutorial that I'm writing. I'd love to have people involved in discussions for what kinds of APIs we ought to add to Redux Toolkit and how they ought to work. Love to have some assistance with the other doc sites as well. Long term, down the road, I'd love to have some people experimenting with React Redux and concurrent mode and seeing how they behave, and maybe even trying to port React Redux and get that version 8 work started and see what it looks like if we call use mutable source inside. And the last item, lesser priority, but I'll toss it out there. I basically had to stop updating my links list repositories 2 years ago because it was just sucking up too much of my time and I couldn't do anything else. And those sites are still useful, but the tutorials lists are rather out of date. There's a lot of newer ones that I would point to instead. And I would love to have those still be a valuable up-to-date resource for people. So I would love to have some folks volunteer to help out with cleaning out old links that are either dead or not useful anymore, adding some newer links. And I have lots of links that ought to go in there. I just don't have time to sort through them right now. So there's lots of things that I would love to have help with. If you're interested, please feel free to contact me on Twitter or Reactiflux, or leave a comment in one of the relevant issues on any of these repositories. Okay, that's actually the last slide I've got, and I'm actually under an hour, which is impressive at this point, given my tendency to go long. So given that, I'm happy to answer questions if people have any. So what do we got?
So if anyone has any questions, just drop them in the comments and I'll be showing them in the screen. So I'm just gonna give it 20 seconds for people to start posting questions. If not, we'll just call it a day. So take advantage that Mark is
in fact,
here,
even looking at the comment list right now, one thing I do see popping up a lot is people are confused by the differences between existing Redux tutorials that are out there and the modern Redux patterns we're showing with Redux Toolkit and the hooks API and stuff. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a whole lot we can do about that. If I could wave a magic wand and replace every single older tutorial, every single line of code in every repository with every object spread operator and everything else with use of Redux Toolkit and the hooks, I would, but I can't. There's thousands of Medium posts and YouTube videos and courses and everything else that all teach the older patterns of using Redux. And to be clear, all that code still works. It's not wrong. It's just not the way we would recommend learning and using Redux at that point. So there is a dichotomy, and I'm hoping that the basics tutorial or the new fundamentals tutorial will actually kind of be that on-ramp of, well, here's kind of the older patterns, but now we get to the end and here's why we do the new stuff instead. But we can't go out and change somebody else's Medium post that shows all the older stuff instead. Sorry, it's not my blog post. So,
Mark, I am Carlos Molina has a question. So, for us starting with Redux, what would you?
I would say go straight to the docs, click the tutorial link on the header bar. That takes you to the new Essentials tutorial. and that'll walk you through how to build a real-world-ish app using Redux Toolkit and the React Redux Hooks API. And it'll explain all of our current best practices and mostly why those exist. You don't have to understand how everything works inside, but it'll show you all the patterns that you can follow to start building something useful right now. And I would actually say read the Essentials tutorial first, then go back and read the Fundamentals tutorial after that to better understand how it works inside. If you want to read the Fundamentals tutorial first and work your way up, that's also valid. But I would suggest starting with the Essentials tutorial so that you can jump in and start building something a little more meaningful right away. Ryan Florence, who helps make the React Router library, has commented a number of times that when he got going early on, he was using Ruby on Rails. He really didn't know Ruby. He certainly didn't know JavaScript. He didn't actually know a whole lot about programming at all. But he was able to follow the examples shown by the Rails documentation and start building real working apps. And then he kind of learned everything else as he went. And so that's kind of the point of the Essentials tutorial. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to know all about how it works, but it'll teach you enough to start building something useful.
Cool. So Ali El Tom, he's willing to help you out. So I'm assuming that you can reach out to him on Twitter, and then Mark can help you out to coordinate that.
Like I said, ping me on Twitter, or go comment in one of the issues in the repos, whichever ones you're interested in helping out at, and we can figure out what a good task would be.
There's another interesting question by Big Grant. Is it worth moving legacy Redux code to Redux Toolkit in 2020?
And the good news is that you can do that incrementally.
Oh, cool.
The basic migration approach is add Redux Toolkit to your project. Look at your code that sets up the store and replace it with Redux Toolkit's Configure Store API once. Then pick a reducer, like in a blogging app, like your state.posts logic. Swap out the reducer code and the actions for Redux Toolkit's create slice, and then just repeat for all the other reducers in the app. And it will shorten your code, it will prevent common mistakes, and it'll help you use the patterns and practices that we recommend. So it's absolutely worth it, and I highly recommend doing so.
So we don't have more questions, but people are like super thankful for everything that you do, and this talk was like amazing. I got so much information. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna be rewatching this video more than one time. It was awesome. And the last question, I thought it was like super interesting because I mean, I just thought that people will be good just by staying in the legacy Redux, but I mean, it's always good to move to the newer stuff, right?
Yep.
So that was like a really good question. I really liked it. So I think that's about it. Mark, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. That was awesome. And thank you so much for everything that you do for the community.
Yep. And I will try to have these slides up on my blog later this evening. So that's blog.isquaredsoftware.com, or the title of the page is Mark's Dev Blog. And so should have that up later tonight.
Mark, do you want to type it in the private chat so I can like post it on the comments so I can like share it?
Yep. So that is here.
Someone said they need actions. Mark, thank you so much. And here's the link to the blog post.
Yep.
Well, that's about it. Thank you guys. See you next month. Mark, thank you so much.
Keep
rocking it. Take it easy.